Angelicus and its Equations here. Spurb.
Welcome to episode 96. 100's almost here. Spurb's Herbs. Today we're going to be talking about a really interesting herb. I was fascinated all week while I was prepping this. We're going to be talking about Kratom or I knew I was going to get caught on this. Mitragyna speciosa. Mitragyna speciosa is the species name for that. I, as always, am your presenter, Dr. Greg Sperber. So without further ado, let's get into it. Today's episode is going to be more interesting than many of the herbs we have looked at. We will be looking at probably one of the most controversial herbs today, Kratom, or Mitragyna speciosa. It is supposed to have pain-relieving properties and is banned or almost banned in many developed countries. As always, we will do our deep dive into this herb of the world and look at its traditional uses, its preparation, interactions, and cautions. And as usual, we will be adding something a little different. We're going to discuss opioids and opioid receptors today, and there's a really good reason why we're going to be discussing those, because we're going to be looking at some of the mechanisms of action of our herb today, and it requires a little bit of knowledge about opioids and opioid receptors. It's going to be another fascinating exploration into the exciting and potentially dangerous archeology of herbs. Please don your cool hat, bring your whip, and join us in the herbal jungle. Before we get going, I wanted to let you know we are starting and continuing an amazing special for our courses. If you use them for continuing education, professional development, or just for your own edification, we are offering 50 hours of courses for an unbelievable price. Normally this would cost $750. However, with the special code 50 CEUs, that's 50 CEUS, this is going to be only $325. That's half off, or less than half off, or only $6.50 per hour. Plus, you can get a free signed copy of one of my books, Just Pay for Shipping and Handling. That is a free copy of Integrative Pharmacology, combining modern pharmacology with integrative medicine, which I have right here, or Playing the Game, a step-by-step approach to accepting insurance as an acupuncturist. Either of those for free. All you need to do is pay for shipping and handling. Just go to the webpage www.integrativemedicinecouncil.org. That's Integrative Medicine Council, COUNCIL.org/CEUS1. CEUS1. So integrativemedicinecouncil.org/CEUS1. CEUS1. For this amazing deal. It's absolutely amazing. Never done anything that good before. All right, I told you we were going to talk about opioid receptors. So as I got into today's herb, I realized we needed to have a discussion about opioids and specifically different types of opioid receptors. This is because today's herb, Kratom, by the way, I looked up the term for this. I always used to call it Kratom or something like that, but it is Kratom is the proper way to say it, at least according to the web. So because today's herb, Kratom, activates these receptors and actually has a lot of the same functions of opioids. A lot of people say it is an opioid. Other people say it is not an opioid. It just activates opioid receptors. So we'll talk about that a little bit. So let's see how these work before we get into our herb. Before we get into the receptors, let's begin by talking about why opioids are used in the first place. The main purpose of opioids is pain relief and the anxiety surrounding moderate to severe pain. These are the leading pain relievers for moderate to severe pain. They can also be used for reducing the cough reflex, intractable diarrhea, and illicitly for their euphoric effects. That's the old opium dens you might have heard about in Asia. Many opioids, such as codeine, dihydrocodeine, dextromethorphan, and hydrocodone, are widely used as antitussives, which are stop coughing medications, usually in combination with an antihistamine or decongestant. There are three major opioid receptors. There's the mu receptor, kappa, and delta receptors. And receptors are important in drugs. That's how most drugs work, is by activating receptors in the body. Not all, but most, or at least a lot of them, use receptors and then have biological effects. Opioid drugs have different affinities for each of these receptors, these three receptors, mu, kappa, and delta. Pain relief is mostly moderated by the mu receptors, with some help from kappa receptors in the dorsal horn of the spinal cord. In general, the receptors work by decreasing excitatory neurotransmitter release of the presynaptic neuron and dampening the response of the postsynaptic neuron. Okay, so this gets a little technical here. Let me get into this. So normally the way a neural connection works is you have an action potential, which is a change in the voltage of the neural the neural membrane, and that propagates down the nerve and gets to the end of the nerve. At the end of the nerve, it would just stop, but there are some mechanisms to get it past one neuron into the next neuron. Now, the space between neurons is called the synapse. That is a space. It's not an actual connection. There's a little gap between every neuron. And so the presynaptic neuron will usually release a neurotransmitter, which will diffuse across the synapse and then cause a postsynaptic neuron receptor to respond to that neurotransmitter. So that's the normal approach to this. So opioids, they work by decreasing excitatory neurotransmitter release of the presynaptic neuron. So it makes less of that neurotransmitter release that happens from the presynaptic neuron, and it dampens the response of the postsynaptic neuron. So the postsynaptic receptors don't work as well. Whatever that is a competitive inhibition, whatever, there's lots of different mechanisms, but that's how this works. And so that's how opioids work in general. In the spinal cord, opioids reduce the release of substance P, a major attenuator of pain. So it actually increases pain when substance P is released. So P, I think, stands for pain. And so when you have less substance P, you have less pain, and opioids can reduce that release of substance P. A fourth opioid receptor has been recently discovered. The role of the NOFQ receptor, it's N/OFQ, but it's usually pronounced NOFQ receptor, is still not completely understood, but appears to enhance or decrease analgesia or pain relief, depending on where the receptor is located. How opioids affect this receptor is being studied. So we're not sure. I didn't see anything as we're talking about kratom today. Didn't see anything about the NOFQ receptor being involved with kratom. But then again, I don't know a lot about normal opioids affecting NOFQ receptors. We're still kind of studying it at this point. Opioid receptors are located throughout the body, and their placement helps explain their beneficial as well as adverse effects. In the brainstem, which is the most primitive part of the brain, helps moderate respiration, blood pressure, cough, nausea and vomiting, meiosis, which is narrowing of the pupils, and stomach secretions. And so it does all that. That's where a lot of the side effects happen. One of the big issues with opioids is that it can cause respiratory depression. So it makes you breathe less, and to the point where the body kind of can forget to breathe. And so that's the brainstem is where that can play a role. The cough center is in there as well. So there's a lot of areas when it affects the brainstem that can explain some of the effects of opioids. The medial thalamus is another area in the brain, helps moderate pain that has an emotional component and is poorly localized. Spinal cord, initial integration of sensory information is performed here, and painful stimuli can be modified. So remember, the spinal cord is going to carry the information from the periphery to the brain, and so that's where we first start to experience pain. It carries pain, what we call efferents, or nerves going to the brain. We have the hypothalamus. Hypothalamus, if you're not familiar with it, is a part of the brain that directly controls the pituitary. The pituitary is called the master endocrine glands. The hypothalamus is very important for our endocrine system. And here neuroendocrine effects are moderated here by opioid receptors in the hypothalamus. We have the limbic system as part of the emotional system of the brain. Opioid effects here are mainly modification of emotional behavior. And opioids can certainly affect emotions. And then we have the periphery. So everything else basically may prevent inflammatory chemical release. If you prevent inflammatory chemical release, you also reduce pain because most of the inflammatory chemicals are going to increase pain. So with that brief introduction into opioids and opioid receptors, that should help us understand as we discuss how kratom exerts its effects. So without further ado, here's kratom. So kratom is in the family Rubiaceae, which we're going to talk about. We've talked about it with several other herbs in our Spurbs Herbs series. We're going to talk about what that family is. The specific species here is Mitragyna speciosa, Korth in parentheses, Havel. Now remember, the Korth and Havel refer to the biologists or botanists who first categorized it. And when it's in parentheses like Korth is here, it was originally categorized by Korth, which is it's Korth period. So that's a shortening of the name. And then it was revised by Havel into the current state. That's what this all means. So Mitragyna speciosa, Korth, Havel. The medicinal part is the leaves. There's lots of other names. A lot of these stem from the South Asian countries where kratom originates. So they are Thang, I don't know exactly the pronunciation, but I'll do my best here. Thang, Kakuam, Tom, Ketum, Biak, kratom with a C, gratum with a G, Ithang, Katan, Kademba, Krathum with an H in the middle, Kratin, rather than M and N at the end, Kratom, Medat, Mangda leaf, Mombog, Mitragyne extract, Nauclea speciosa, that sounds like an old name for this, 4x100 or 4x100, Krypton, which actually usually, as I read further, is more about the main ingredient in within kratom. And then another name is herbal speedball. So that sounds a little ominous. So let's talk about the Rubiaceae family. The Rubiaceae or madder family consists of 611 genera and over 13,150 species. They are herbs, shrubs, and trees, mostly in tropical areas. They have opposing leaves with stipules or in whorls with unbroken leaf margins and leaf-like appendages at the base of the leaf stalks. The leaves usually are large and evergreen in tropical species, deciduous in temperate species, and needle-like or scale-like in desert species. The plants may bear a single flower or many small flowers clustered together. The fruits can be berries, drupes, capsules, or schizocarps, which are dry fruits that split into segments of a single seed. Coffee, quinine, ipecac, kratom, and gambir used in tannin all come from or are extracts from members of this family. And many are also common ornamentals. So that is a brief overview of the Rubiaceae family. Let's get into the history of kratom. According to Grundmann et al., traditional use of kratom in Southeast Asia was first reported in 1836, but likely dates back further primarily for two reasons: as an opium substitute in Malaysia and as a stimulant to increase work efficiency in Thailand. Sonosi et al. Say kratom, Mitragyna speciosa Korth of the Rubiaceae family, is a 4 to 16 meter high tropical tree indigenous to Southeast Asia, the Philippines, and New Guinea. Traditionally, in certain regions of Southeast Asia, the chopped, fresh, or dried leaves of the tree are chewed and made into tea by local manual laborers to combat fatigue and improve work productivity. In addition, kratom preparations have also been used for centuries during socio-religious ceremonies and to treat various medical conditions, such as morphine dependence in Thailand and as opium substitute in Malaya. It has been suggested that the genus was given the Mitragyna name by the Dutch botanist Corthels because the leaves and the stigmas of the flowers of the plant resemble the shape of a bishop's mitre. However, considering its variety of uses, it could be speculated that the term derives from the Mithraic cults seen as a source of spiritual transcendence for thousands of years. According to Mireles et al., two types of kratom can be identified based on the color of the leaf vein, which can be either green or red. Locals usually prefer the red vein, characterized by its bitterness and longer effects. Fresh leaves at a dosage of normally 10 to 30 fresh leaves per day are mostly used, chewed, swallowed as a powder, but they can also be dried for smoking or used to make tea. In 1943, kratom was put under regulatory control by the Kratom Act in Thailand, which is believed to be an economic move rather than a decision based on the concern for the public health. During this time, taxes were involved with the opium trade, and because it was so expensive, people started to use kratom as a substitute, and this had consequences for the Thai government's income. Later in 1979, kratom was classified in Category 5 of a narcotics classification by the Thai government in the Narcotics Act, the same as cannabis, opium, and hallucinogenic mushrooms, the least restrictive and punitive level. So not as serious. Those things would be considered quite serious in the U.S., except for maybe cannabis. But there you go. So we can't really talk about kratom without talking about its legal status. And so for this herb, we needed to add a new heading to our usual discussion. The legal status of kratom is always changing. One article says it's banned in 6 states in the United States, including Alabama, Arkansas, Indiana, Rhode Island, Vermont, and Wisconsin. Advocates have passed the Kratom Consumer Protection Act, or the KCPA, in 4 states, including Arizona, Georgia, Nevada, and Utah. Surprisingly, Utah. Most other states say it is legal, but it may be regulated. There are also local regulations. For example, the big city I am closest to is San Diego, which bans it. However, it's widely available, and there are quite a few stores in the county outside the city. In fact, where I'm at, when I was looking up kratom, I wanted to take photos, and I wanted to see if there's some kratom around locally. Within a few miles of me, there were at least 2 or 3 stores that were exclusively kratom stores. They sold nothing else other than kratom in these stores. Now, these were, I think, the 2 that I'm thinking of were in La Mesa, which is a suburb outside of San Diego County. It's a city unto itself. And so it's not regulated by San Diego City regulations where it's banned. The same patchwork of legality seems to be the norm internationally as well. It is illegal in the following countries: Australia, Denmark, Finland, Israel, Japan, Latvia, Lithuania, Myanmar, Malaysia, Poland, Romania, Russia, Singapore, South Korea, Sweden, Thailand, and Vietnam. Now, they say Thailand here, but I don't think it's formally banned. Anyways, it is also illegal in New Zealand without a doctor's prescription. So if a doctor prescribed it, you can have it in New Zealand. It's also illegal in Chile, according to a different source. Wikipedia, which is not one of my favorite sources in the world, but sometimes it has really good information. Wikipedia adds Bulgaria, Ireland, Norway, and the United Kingdom. So why is it illegal in these areas? Many findings indicate the benefits, which we will be discussing, do not outweigh the risks, which we will also talk about. It may be addictive. That is one of the major concerns for it. And there are deaths attributable to its use. Now, people will argue about whether they were really from kratom use or not. That's fine. But there are deaths that are surrounding the use of kratom. So let's talk about some more information about kratom. According to the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration of the United States, an estimated 1.7 million Americans used kratom in 2021. So that's a lot of use. A web page, so that's 1.7 million out of about, I think we're up to, what are we up to, like 350, 400 million people, something like that. A web page from an addiction treatment center discusses 3 types of kratom, all from the same plant. So we mentioned red and green. This also adds in white. So red vein kratom is from the mature leaves, is high in the active alkaloids, potent and fast acting, and used for pain relief, sedation, an increase in energy, and may help with migraines, arthritis, and opioid withdrawal. Now, I think it's interesting, and we'll see this in some of the others, is it sedates and increases energy. That's a weird combination. Those are the opposites. So very interesting. So that's red vein kratom. Green vein kratom are semi-mature leaves, which balances alkaloid content, which both provides energy and calm. White vein kratom is from young leaves, high in stimulating alkaloids, and is energizing and uplifting. So we have red, which is mature, we have green, which is semi-mature, and white, which is young. Other uses. As I was reviewing the literature, the only non-medicinal use for kratom was a mention of its use as incense. This is suspicious, though, as smoking kratom is a delivery system for medicinal use. So one of the things that I read was that one of the countries, it's illegal, but you can buy it for incense, which to me seems like a loophole for people who want to use its medicinal substances, medicinal uses, but they didn't want them to do that, so they provided this incense sort of as almost as a loophole. I don't know. None of them really talk about how sweet smelling or incense smelling is. I don't know what it smells like as incense, but apparently that is one of the uses of it. Traditional uses. So to start off with, none of our usual texts on Western herbs or anything along those lines has an entry on kratom. So we had to go to the internet, and of course I tend to try to stay with scientific and more reliable sources, though there were a few addiction centers pages that had some really good information that I included, but I'm clearly saying they're addiction centers, so you know, because I always say that because the addiction centers can be a little suspect because they have an economic reason for explaining different aspects of kratom versus a more scientific approach. So Grundman et al., which was a really good overview of kratom. I believe that's the one that was the Arizona Naturopathic Doctors Association put this one out. So the Grundman and their team says, in Southeast Asia, fresh kratom leaves were chewed to increase work efficiency and relieve fatigue for manual laborers. Fresh and dried leaves were also brewed into teas in Malaysia and Thailand for a range of ailments, including diabetes, diarrhea, fever, pain, and for use as a wound poultice. It was and remains used as a substitute for opium and to reduce opioid withdrawal symptoms both in Asian countries and in the West. There's no scientific information on traditional uses of kratom preparations before the 2000s outside of Asia. Mireilles and their team says kratom was originally used mainly for its medicinal value in treating mild medical problems, namely fever, diarrhea, diabetes, pain as a wound poultice, and to reduce the strain and fatigue of physical labor. However, it became also known and used to suppress opiate withdrawal symptoms given its affordability and availability. In recent years, young consumers started to use kratom tea as a base for a cocktail known as 4x100 or 4x100, consisting of kratom tea, cough syrup, Coca-Cola, and ice cubes. This eventually became a concern since these consumers were using additives such as benzodiazepines, which are anxiolytics or anti-anxiety medications to enhance the effects. Ulbricht and their team says Mitragyna speciosa has reportedly been used for centuries for its psychoactive properties, opium-like effects, and ability to treat opioid addiction and opioid withdrawal. When I first hear that, I go, okay, well, wait, it's opioid withdrawal and addictions. I mean, aren't those more modern? No, remember, opioids have been used for thousands of years. So that's not all that new. Continuing with what they say, in recent years, it has grown in popularity as a rave drug. And then finally, Singh and their team has a terrific section on traditional uses of kratom. Kratom has been used for a wide variety of purposes in Southeast Asia, including for its perceived medical value and anti-fatigue properties. It's also used as a recreational drink when relaxing and socializing, largely among men and in some Thai villages as part of small religious ceremonies. Kratom leaves are used widely by women in villages as a household remedy for common ailments such as fever, cough, hypertension, diabetes, pain, and anxiety. It is also applied as a wound poultice and believed to be a deworming agent and appetite suppressor. One Malaysian study cited self-reports of ketam, which is another name for kratom, being used as an aphrodisiac to heighten sexual desire. Interestingly, the only medical use of kratom in the West has been to treat chronic pain. Men, on the other hand, consume kratom in the morning to improve work productivity and to combat fatigue. The coca and opium-like effects help manual laborers, e.g. farmers, rubber tapers, machine drivers, and fishermen, and those working in the blistering heat to continue without tiring. Most male workers learned to use kratom from other users in the community. In earlier periods in Malaya, where opium use was common, those who relied on opium repeatedly turned to ketam in times of opium scarcity. In the evenings, men use kratom as a drink when they relax and socialize. In villages, kratom is also served as a drink to male guests during social gatherings. Serves as a substitute for alcohol among Muslims in Malaysia and South Thailand because alcohol consumption is against Islamic teachings. Because kratom users are not considered to be alcohol users, they are free from the social stigma attached to those consuming alcohol. Kratom has also earned a place in some village religious ceremonies where it is offered to a god or spirit as a precious gift for fulfilling their desires or vows. And that is traditional uses. Let's talk about dosage and preparation. So according to Grundman and their team, kratom is primarily consumed orally. It is available in the United States, as powder, tablets, capsules, raw leaves, mostly dried, and concentrated extracts, mostly containing varying amounts of ethanol, alcohol. The doses range widely based on the dosage form, with powders usually suggesting a dose of 3 to 5 grams, while concentrated liquid extracts may only require 1 to 2 drops to be added to a beverage, according to manufacturer recommendations. Users may administer the extract several times per day to achieve improvement of their condition, although a majority appear to use the extract 3 times per day in doses of 3 to 5 grams. Self-dosing in combination with currently unregulated kratom product quality results in highly variable concentrations of the active ingredients mitragynine and 7-hydroxymitragynine. Another addiction center discusses dosing in an article about kratom, saying there are 3 major forms of dosing. Kratom is sometimes smoked, but is usually taken orally. Locals in Southeast Asia sometimes chew the leaves fresh from the trees or eat them in food. In the United States, kratom is available in several formats, all based on M. speciosa leaves, and comes either whole or ground up. Powder. Kratom powder is made by grinding the dried leaves and is usually sold in packets labeled not for human consumption, I think, to get around any legalities. Capsules, pills, or tablets. The powder is packaged into kratom capsules or pressed into kratom pills or kratom tablets. and tea. Kratom tea is made by brewing the dried or powdered leaves. The same article also discusses dosing of kratom. Kratom is not regulated or standardized and may be cut with other plant species additives. As such, it may be difficult to know what dose one is taking. The effects of kratom, particularly the stimulant and opioid-like effects, are dose dependent. Low to moderate doses, 1 gram to 5 grams of raw leaves, usually produce a stimulant effect that is described as pleasant but not intense like other stimulants such as cocaine or methamphetamines. Moderate to high doses, 5 grams to 15 grams, result in effects similar to opioids such as analgesia and euphoria. The euphoric effects are described as less intense than those of opioids. High doses above 15 grams are toxic and may involve serious side effects and overdose. People usually take between 1 and 3 doses per day. Many sources, including Ulbricht and their team, WebMD, and the United States Drug Enforcement Administration, say there's not enough information to determine safe doses, while some also add there are no safe uses and therefore no safe dosing for this herb. Quality. While it was very difficult to determine high-quality kratom, there were concerns about heavy metals, especially nickel and lead. The U.S. FDA conducted laboratory testing of 30 different kratom products from a variety of sources to determine if they contain heavy metals. The analysis found significant levels of lead and nickel at concentrations that exceed safe exposure for oral daily drug intake. Based on reported kratom usage patterns, heavy kratom users may be exposed to levels of lead and nickel many times greater than the safe daily exposure. Based on these test results, the typical long-term kratom user could potentially develop heavy metal poisoning, which could include nervous system or kidney damage, anemia, high blood pressure, and/or increased risk of certain cancers. So what does kratom do according to Chinese medicine, Chinese medical actions? There aren't many sources on a Google source for the Chinese medical actions of kratom. One source was a blog post from Michael Tierra. If you're not familiar with Michael Tierra, he's written books. He's quite well known and respected herbalist in both Western and Chinese traditions. He says kratom is bitter and warm and stimulating in small amounts, cool and sedating in large doses, and enters the liver, lung, heart, and large intestine. Its Chinese properties include relieves pain, calms Shen, astringes lung qi, and astringes the large intestine. As we're about to find out about kratom, or at least the primary constituents, they activate opioid receptors. That is the key. That's why we talked about opioid receptors earlier. Based on this, I think we need to look at one herb in the Chinese Materia Medica as a comparison to kratom, and that herb is Yingsu Ke, or Papaverus pericarpium, or the opium husk. This is the husk around the opium seeds. It has similar functions to opioids, contains the leakage of lung qi for chronic cough, binds up the intestines, and alleviates pain. Another function is not necessarily opiate-like, stabilizes the lower burner for polyuria or frequent urination, spermatorrhea, which is loss of sperm, spontaneous loss of sperm, or vaginal discharge. While traditionally Yingsu Ke was in the stabilize and bind category of herbs, it is currently listed in obsolete substances. Bensky et al., which is one of our main books for single Chinese herbs, says it is sour, astringent, neutral, toxic, and enters the kidney, large intestine, and lung. While there are differences between these two possible Chinese medical approaches to kratom, there's also a lot of overlap. Both say it enters the lung and large intestine. They completely disagree about its tastes and temperature. Tierra says it can be both warm and cool depending on dose, while Bensky et al. Say it is neutral. I think they can all be correct and it lands on the neutral temperature. As far as channels are concerned, they agree on lung and large intestine, but no others. I think it should enter the liver, lung, large intestine, heart, and maybe the kidney. As for taste, there's no agreement. There's no agreement. Much of the literature mentions the bitter nature of kratom, and I think that should be one of the tastes. And since both have astringent qualities, it should be sour, as that is the astringent taste. They generally agree on functions, with Tierra saying it calms the shen. Shen meaning spirit, it's or mind, so which I think it does. And Ying Suka stabilizing the lower burner, which I don't think kratom does. Putting all of that together, my take is kratom is bitter, sour, neutral, and toxic. I think we have to add in the toxic there. Enters the lung, large intestine, liver, and heart, and it alleviates pain, stops coughing. I have in parentheses astringes the lungs, calms the shen, and binds the intestines. Comparisons and combinations. There weren't any direct comparisons or combinations for this herb in our literature searches. This was, in Western herbology, often uses single herbs, but I think more than even most most Western herbs, this is kind of a singular use herb. In other words, when you use this herb, you're not combining it with anything else to amplify effects or to get to the same place. This is a very potent herb on its own, so it's usually used on its own. Contents. Sinosi et al. Says the phytochemicals isolated from various parts of kratom tree include over 40 structurally related alkaloids, of which mitragyna is the most important, with up to 66% purity in the extract of leaves from Thailand and only 12% in kratom leaves from Malaysia. So that's really interesting. So depending on where it grows, means that it can vary from 12% of the extract to 66% of the extract. That's a huge difference. This alkaloid is the one responsible for analgesic activity that has been linked to kratom use, mostly due to its potent opioid agonist property. Although mitragyna can act on the mu, kappa, and delta opioid receptors, as we talked about earlier, it is structurally different from morphine and other components from the opioid family. The reason why it has been suggested is that it might also present with a more broad receptor binding activity. Mitragyna and its analogs in kratom, including speciogynin, 7%, painanthine, 9%, and speciociliatine, 1%, are indole alkaloids possessing a monoterpene iridoid moiety, moiety meaning shape or space. So if all those words sound a little bit interesting to you, I do have a course that I talk about pharmacognosy, and I've talked about it in Spurbs Herbs as well, where we've talked about monoterpenes and iridoids. But it's heavy biochemistry. Differently, 7-hydroxymitragynin, a minor component, only 2% of M. speciosa, when isolated, demonstrates a potent antinociceptive activity in mice. So antinociceptive means that it combats pain. So nociception is the perception of pain. So antinociceptive, so the preventing the perception of pain in mice. So that's the important aspect of it. Here, as we see that it works well in mice, we're going to find out. I don't think there's a lot of science showing that it helps pain relief in humans at this point. It is now considered to be a major contributory, that's the 7-hydroxymitragynin, is now considered to be a major contributory factor for the analgesic properties of M. speciosa due to its selectivity for mu and kappa opioid receptors. Remember, we talked about mu, kappa, and deltoid, but we said mu and kappa are the ones that really help with pain, are the pain receptors. The presence of a hydroxyl group at C7, carbon 7, increases the potency of 7-hydroxymitragynin to be 13 and 46-fold higher than morphine and mitragynin, respectively, both in vitro and in vivo. So what that means is it is 13 times more potent than morphine. Just stop there. That's huge. So that's a big one. And it's 46 times higher than in the other major constituent, mitragynine, in this herb. So, and those were from in vitro and in vivo tests. So that sounds kind of cool, and everything is Latin and all that stuff. No, in vitro means in glass. That's literally what it means, in glass. That doesn't necessarily mean that that is at all helpful in life. In vivo means in life, and that usually means non-humans. So we're talking animals, and that can be useful, but again, that's not humans. So we don't know if that has the same effects in humans or not. It certainly points to something, and it certainly indicates we need to have some human human research happening here. But in and of itself, in vitro and in vivo are not clinically useful. They're useful for research purposes. If you see these things in vitro and then in vivo, you go, okay, we need to design some clinical tests, some clinical tests meaning in humans. But until then, who knows? So going back to Sinosi et al.'s paper, this might be one of the main pharmacological markers of kratom products' quality and potency. Recent studies further revealed how complex is kratom's pharmacology, involving a kappa opioid and dopamine D1 receptors interaction in its various effects. Serotonergic and adrenergic. So serotonergic means involving serotonin, and adrenergic means involving epinephrine or norepinephrine. So serotonergic and adrenergic pathways have also been involved in the effects of mitragynine, mostly due to its broad affinity to different receptors. Now that may sound interesting on the surface, okay, ooh, interesting, it affects all these different potential receptors. But here's the but, is generally when drugs have many receptors, a lot of the side effects of those drugs are because it affects so many different receptors. Generally in drugs, we prefer a much tighter target of the receptors rather than a whole bunch of different receptors. And here's the thing with kratom, we're looking at whole herb extracts, which means that there may be individual aspects that target individual receptors. If we can kind of parse them out, we might have some very interesting constituents that could be medically useful, but we haven't done that yet. Indeed, the pharmacological mechanisms responsible for stimulant activity are yet to be clearly established. Another confounding factor might be the action of some other isolated compounds, speciociliatine, speciogynine, and penantheine, for example, whose effects were not inhibited by naloxone in animal studies. So that's interesting. Naloxone is an opioid antagonist. It'll actually, that is, one of the drugs that is used to reverse an opioid overdose. And so if it wasn't inhibited by naloxone in animal studies, are they actually affecting the opioid receptor? So, and if they are, then they're using a novel way to do that. So very interesting, more studies. Continuing with the science, Grundman et al. Says kratom preparations may be used for a wide range of self-treatment options by patients. Surveys and case reports describe the use for acute and or chronic pain, mitigation of opioid prescription and other drug dependency withdrawal symptoms, substitution of opioid medication or illicit opioid drugs, harm reduction measures in opioid withdrawal, depressive or anxiety disorders, attention deficit and hyperactivity disorders, ADHD, ADD, bipolar disorder, post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, and other conditions. In addition, a person may use kratom recreationally to obtain relaxation, improved mood, increased energy, or an altered state of consciousness, a high, especially if used in combination with other drugs such as alcohol, benzodiazepines, opioids, cocaine, or amphetamines. Mitragyna and their team describes 5 main areas of effects of kratom, including analgesic, anti-inflammatory, antidepressant, antioxidant, and antibacterial. They made that one rather than separate, and gastrointestinal effects. While many of them had some evidence in mice for these effects, none of these had any clinical evidence. This was from Mitragyna. I'm not saying there isn't clinical evidence for it, but Mitragyna did not describe any clinical evidence for any of those things. Ulbricht et al. concludes there is lack of available evidence in support of Mitragyna speciosa for any clinical indication. Now that is one of the, it was an excellent review. Olbrook's review was an excellent review, but it was written in 2013, so it's getting a little bit old. The Mirelis that didn't have any clinical was 2019, so still, that's considered modern, but still 5 years old. Here we go. A systematic review of the literature in 2021 found positive evidence for treating pain, withdrawal and independence, gastrointestinal effects, and anthelmintic effects. That's anti-worm effects. However, these were all in animals, in vivo or in vitro. None were clinical. So just a few years ago, we still don't have any clinical research on this. Jentz and Pippin 2023 discussed the mechanism of action of kratom. Kratom has only 4 known pharmacologically active compounds. Of these active compounds, mitragynine is the most prevalent, but 7-hydroxymitragynine is more pharmacologically active. Also, 7-hydroxymitragynine is an oxidized metabolite of mitragynine. Mitragynine is hepatically metabolized to 7-hydroxymitragynine. In other words, it's changed in the liver. Compared to morphine, 7-hydroxymitragynine has about 13 times the affinity for opioid receptors. 7-hydroxymitragynine has about 46 times the affinity for opioid receptors compared to mitragynine. I mentioned those earlier. Some studies suggest mitragynine is an agonist at the mu and delta receptors, while 7-hydroxymitragynine targets the mu and kappa receptors, although some studies argue that both act as partial agonists at the mu and delta receptors. So agonist means it activates the receptors, and a partial agonist means that it doesn't fully activate it. And that, depending on the effects you're looking at, can be positive or negative. So one of the important differences between opioids and the alkaloids in kratom is that they are pharmacologically and structurally different. Like opioids, the alkaloids from kratom initiate G protein coupled receptors, GPCR, signaling. However, the major difference is that the kratom alkaloids don't initiate the beta-arrestin pathway. This is important because the beta-arrestin pathway is responsible for some of the adverse symptomatology seen in opioid use, including respiratory depression, sedation, and constipation. So there you go. So what they're saying is, okay, here's how it works. It's very similar to opioids, but different. And those differences might be beneficial for the use of kratom versus opioids. So that's kind of the bottom line here with Jentz and Pippin. So overall, the science, to me, doesn't speak to anything clinical at this point. It has a lot of interesting things, and it could do this or that and the other, but it hasn't been studied. It doesn't mean it doesn't do it just because it hasn't been studied, but I think we need studies. And given the dangers of kratom, which we're going to get into in just a little bit, I'd be very concerned about patients taking this. And I have had one patient who was on kratom. He had knee pain, and kratom was the only thing that controlled the knee pain. He wanted to see if acupuncture could help. But he had tried lots of other things and nothing really helped. And he really presented to me like someone who is an addict. He really, really did. It was like anything I said, okay, well, can you stop the kratom for a little bit to see if the acupuncture will work? If kratom is affecting opioid receptors, acupuncture can affect opioid receptors. So I really want you off the kratom to see if the acupuncture can help. And he just would not even consider it at all for even a week, even a few days. I couldn't get him off the kratom, and he talked about it with reverence. Just the overall impression I got was the impression I get with a lot of the addicts that I've dealt with in my career. So very interesting. Okay, moving on to drug-herb interactions. There are several potential drug-herb interactions with kratom. Combining Mitragyna speciosa kratom with alcohol, benzodiazepines, opioid sedatives, and neurologic agents may cause oversedation or potentially respiratory depression. Combining Mitragyna speciosa kratom with caffeine, stimulants, cocaine, or the herb yohimbine may cause overstimulation or elevated blood pressure. One study found kratom inhibits cytochrome P451A2, 2C19, and 3A4. Another study adds 2D6 inhibition. So if you're not familiar with cytochrome P450, we usually look at it and talk about it. Cytochrome P450 is one of what I would call the four major risks for drug-herb interactions, and especially 3A4 is at high risk. About 40 to 60% of drugs utilize 3A4 for metabolism. So if anything inhibits or affects that, it can really cause drug-herb interactions. It appears kratom may inhibit, but is not a substrate of P-glycoprotein. This would be another one of those four major targets of drug-herb interaction risks. So the fact that it inhibits P-glycoprotein is an issue. Finally, combining kratom with monoamine oxidase inhibitors, including passion flower, Syrian rue, or ayahuasca, may cause serious reactions. And what was interesting was it caused serious reactions. Now, all of these are D-level evidence, lowest level of evidence. At least with the cytochrome P450 and the P-glycoprotein, those were in vitro, which is a D-level evidence, but it's as close as we get to looking at those. The rest were often just kind of expert opinion or maybe some animal studies. So this last one may cause serious reactions. I don't know what kind of serious reactions. They did get into it, this particular review, so I'm not sure. Finally, let's get into concerns about kratom. There are extensive lists of adverse effects, red flags, and toxicology of kratom. Jensen Pippin summarized these. Kratom and its metabolites can cause a variety of symptoms, including neurologic, metabolic, and psychological symptoms. A study by the National Poison Data System in 2019 found that the most common presenting symptoms after kratom ingestion included agitation, tachycardia or rapid heartbeat, drowsiness, and confusion. As many patients with chronic pain or a history of opioid dependence turn to alternatives for managing their symptoms, kratom has become a popular choice. However, given this substance is unregulated, it has the potential for patients to develop dependence, addiction, and toxicity. So when we say dependence and addiction, those are addiction, and that becomes a major area of concern. A lot of people are saying it's not addictive. A lot of people are saying it is addictive. Here's the bottom line to me is anyone involved in the industry, anyone taking it and they say it's not addictive, I don't buy it, because addicts obfuscate. That is a hallmark of addiction, is that they will deny. Denial is huge. So you can't trust anyone in the profession, or when I say the profession, anyone who is in the business of kratom and people taking kratom. They're not the sources, even though they have the most information about what it's like to take it. They also aren't addiction experts, and have a fundamental bias against addiction. Okay, continuing with Jensen Pippin. Multiple organ systems are at risk for potential injury due to kratom ingestion. Multiple case studies have found a range of toxicities and adverse events associated with kratom use, including hepatotoxicity or toxicity to the liver, seizure and coma, lung injury, kidney injury, and cardiotoxicity, so toxicity towards the heart. Pregnant patients who use kratom have an additional risk of their newborns developing neonatal abstinence syndrome. Long-term cognitive impairment has also been seen in those with chronic kratom use. In some cases, kratom toxicity has also been linked to death. It is also important to remember that kratom is an unregulated substance, so the potential for tampering makes it potentially dangerous. Also, patients with a variety of polysubstance abuse are predisposed to kratom toxicity and death. In other words, if you've had other substance issues, this is more dangerous. Based on these adverse effects, Jensen Pippin also discussed potential contraindications. Patients with liver, neurologic, pulmonary, renal, or cardiac disease should avoid this substance, as there have been multiple case studies showing that kratom can potentially cause injury to these organ systems. It is also best for pregnant patients to avoid kratom use due to the potential for newborns to develop neonatal abstinence syndrome. The unregulated status of this substance makes it difficult to ascertain the actual concentration of its active metabolites, making kratom ingestion potentially harmful. Patients with a history of polysubstance abuse should also attempt to avoid this substance, as polysubstance abuse is a risk factor linked to kratom-related death. So they just took all those cautions and made them into contraindications. Grunman et al. Also discuss adverse effects. The most common adverse effects with the use of kratom are nausea, vomiting, constipation, stomach upset, and either drowsiness, dizziness, or irritability, agitation. Dry mouth, sweating, sedation, and tachycardia have been reported in doses over 8 grams. Intrahepatic cholestasis, so that's within the liver, gallstones basically, and hepatic liver enzyme elevation has been reported with chronic and frequent use 1 month or longer of kratom. Liver function returned to normal after cessation of kratom use. That's a big indication. Withdrawal symptoms associated with kratom cessation are dose-dependent and may include decreased appetite, diarrhea, agitation, sedation, insomnia, hallucination, changes in heart rate and blood pressure, and seizures. Respiratory depression and hemorrhagic stroke, which were reported in fatalities involving kratom, could not be causally linked to the ingestion since they also involved other drugs and or medications. So in other words, kratom is associated with these deaths, but may or may not be the cause of them. Okay, there we go. Summary. We started our discussion today with a look at the current state of artificial intelligence. Oh, no, we did not. I did not change that. We started it by looking at opioid receptors and opioids in general. And from there, we talked about kratom and its potential, its similarity to opioids, its fact that it might be very helpful for pain relief, but also the fact that it could be quite, there are quite a number of concerns, which on the overall, do the benefits outweigh the risks? And I think most medical professionals at this point are saying no, they do not. Overall, this was a fascinating, a very different herb for us to look at, and we don't know how helpful if the benefits outweigh the risk until there's more clinical studies, and so we really need to have more clinical studies as well. In our next episode, we will be exploring another interesting Chinese herb, Sangye morifolium or white mulberry leaf. This herb is in the Chinese medical subcategory of cool acrid herbs that release the exterior under the category of release the exterior herbs. It is helpful for certain types of colds and helps the eyes, among other functions, for this relatively commonly used herb. And as usual, we will explore something a little different. Please join us for this intriguing episode. See you in 2 weeks. Thank you very much. If you like this podcast, please do us a favor. Give us a 5-star rating in your favorite podcast app. We really appreciate you even just thinking about it. And don't forget our amazing continuing education deal, over half off and a free book at www.integrativemedicinecouncil.org. That's Integrative Medicine Council, COUNCIL.org/CEUS1, CEUS1. And I haven't talked about it, but we have that 50-hour deal that we talked about. We also have a 25-hour deal, so check it out. You can always get in touch with me at Dr. Greg at spurbsherbs.com. That's SPERBSHERBS.com, or at our website, www.spurbsherbs.com. And as usual, today we have a big bibliography. Thank you very much.
Spurbs Herbs. The proceeding was presented by Dr. Greg Sperber. We would like to thank Janelle for all her support and everybody else who contributed to this program.
Janelle.
Timothy
Nick
Dobbins,
Rogers,
Campbell,